terror seized the pristine corporate lobby as a desperate gunman pressed a pistol to a 7-year-old's temple. "Don't move or she dies!" he screamed. While a ruthless billionaire CEO stood utterly paralyzed, the child's father didn't panic or beg. His chillingly calm response didn't just save her, it dismantled an empire. Vivian Parker didn't tolerate imperfections. At 34, she was the youngest female self-made billionaire in the country, the founder and CEO of Parker Logistics, an empire built on ruthless efficiency and the acquisition of struggling competitors. She walked through the sprawling, glass-enclosed atrium of her Chicago headquarters with the stride of an apex predator. Behind her trailed a nervous flock of executives, clipboards and tablets clutched to their chests. Vivian wore a custom-tailored charcoal suit that cost more than most of her employees made in a year. Her eyes, a striking, icy blue, scanned the lobby, searching for anything out of place. Today, there was a glaring imperfection. Sitting on a minimalist, brushed steel bench designed by a renowned Swedish artist, a bench explicitly placed for aesthetic purposes and not for sitting, was a little girl. She was perhaps 7 years old, wearing faded denim overalls and swinging a pair of scuffed red sneakers. She was intensely focused on a battered sketchbook, her tongue poking out of the corner of her mouth as she dragged a green crayon across the page. Vivian stopped abruptly. Her entourage collided with each other behind her like a multi-car pileup. "Collins," Vivian snapped, not taking her eyes off the child. The head of building security, a burly man named David Collins, stepped forward immediately. "Yes, Miss Parker?" "Why is there a child using a $500,000 art installation as a playground in my lobby?" Her voice was perfectly level, yet it carried a sharp, frigid edge that made the nearby executives wince. Collins cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. "She belongs to the contractor, ma'am, the man hired to restore the vintage mahogany conference table for Boardroom B. We had to let them use the freight entrance, but he needed to sign some paperwork at the front desk. He didn't have a sitter." "I am running a global logistics firm, Collins, not a daycare center," Vivian said coldly. "Have them removed. The table can wait." "Actually, the table is already upstairs, ma'am, and will be out of your hair in exactly 2 minutes. The voice came from behind Vivian. It was deep, resonant, and completely devoid of the trembling deference she was accustomed to hearing. Vivian turned slowly. Standing a few feet away was Ariston Whitaker. He was 32, tall and broad-shouldered, with the lean, hardened muscle of a man who worked with his hands. His jeans were dusted with sawdust, and a simple grey t-shirt clung to his frame. He wiped a smudge of wood stain from his jaw with a rag, his dark brown eyes meeting Vivian's icy blue stare without flinching. Ariston was a former combat medic who had served 2 tours overseas before returning home to a quiet life. A beautiful wife and a passion for woodworking. But life had a cruel sense of humor. 3 years ago, his wife, Sarah, had lost a grueling, expensive battle with leukemia. The medical debt had devoured his savings, forcing him to take any odd job he could to keep a roof over his daughter Lily's head. Today, his old truck had broken down. His neighbor who usually watched Lily was sick, and he had no choice but to bring her into the belly of the corporate beast. "I apologize if Lily was disturbing your artwork," Ariston said, his tone perfectly polite but utterly unyielding. He stepped past the billionaire and held his hand out to his daughter. "Come on, Bug. Time to go." Lily hopped off the steel bench, oblivious to the tension radiating from the adults. She trotted over to her father, clutching her sketchbook. "I drew a dinosaur eating a skyscraper, Daddy," she announced proudly. "It's a masterpiece," Ariston smiled. his entire demeanor softening as he looked down at her. Vivian watched the exchange, feeling an unfamiliar flicker of annoyance. Men usually scrambled to appease her. They apologized profusely. This man, however, seemed entirely unimpressed by her wealth, or her power. "Make sure your security team logs him out, Collins," Vivian said sharply, dismissing Ariston and turning her back. "And inform procurement that I want all future contractors vetted for basic professionalism. This isn't a public park." Ariston paused. He looked at Vivian's rigid back, a mix of pity and exhaustion in his eyes. He had seen commanders with too much power and too little humanity before. "You know," Ariston said quietly, his voice carrying clearly across the marble floor, "it takes a lot of effort to be that miserable all the time. Have a good day, Miss Parker." Several executives gasped audibly. Vivian froze, her jaw tightening. She spun around, her eyes flashing with genuine anger, ready to utterly destroy the arrogant carpenter with a single command. But before the words could leave her mouth, the heavy, reinforced glass doors of the front entrance shattered into a million cascading diamonds. The explosive sound of shattering glass echoed through the massive atrium like a bomb blast. The chaotic symphony of everyday corporate life, clicking heels, murmured phone calls, the hum of elevators, was instantly replaced by a chorus of terrified screams. Through the ruined entrance walked Silas Croft. Silas was a man pushed beyond the brink. 6 months ago, he had been the owner of a mid-sized regional transport company. Then, Vivian Parker decided she wanted his geographic roots. When Silas refused to sell, Vivian used her immense capital to undercut his prices, bleed his clients dry, and initiate a hostile takeover that left Silas utterly bankrupt, drowning in debt and divorced by a wife who couldn't handle the financial ruin. He hadn't slept in days. His clothes were ragged, his eyes were bloodshot, and his hands were trembling violently. In his right hand, he held a heavy, black, semi-automatic pistol. "Parker!" Silas roared, his voice cracking with desperation and fury. He fired a shot into the high, vaulted ceiling. Plaster rained down on the pristine marble floors. Panic erupted. Executives scrambled for cover behind plush sofas and decorative pillars. Collins and 3 other security guards instinctively reached for their holstered weapons, shouting commands that were swallowed by the noise. Ariston's military instincts, dormant for years, snapped awake in a microsecond. Time seemed to slow down. His immediate priority was Lily. He lunged toward his daughter, but the terrified surge of fleeing employees created a physical barrier. A panicked vice president shoved past Ariston, knocking him off balance. In the ensuing chaos, Lily had been pushed toward the center of the lobby, directly into the path of the intruder. Silas, breathing heavily, scanned the room wildly. He saw the armed security guards moving to flank him. He saw Vivian Parker, the architect of his misery, standing frozen near the elevators. And then he saw the little girl in the overalls, standing just a few feet away, paralyzed by fear. Driven by pure, blind adrenaline and the need for leverage, Silas lunged forward. He hooked his left arm around Lily's chest, lifting her off the ground, and pressed the cold steel barrel of the pistol directly against her temple. "Don't move or she dies!" Silas screamed, pivoting to face the security team, using the tiny whimpering child as a human shield. "Drop the guns! Drop them now!" The lobby plunged into a suffocating, terrifying silence, broken only by Lily's quiet, terrified sobs. Vivian Parker stood completely paralyzed. The icy control she maintained over every aspect of her life evaporated in a millisecond. She was a master of boardrooms, of contracts, of calculated risks. She knew how to crush a rival corporation. But facing a broken man with a gun to a child's head? She had no algorithm for this. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. For the first time in her life, the billionaire was entirely powerless. "Drop the weapons," Silas shrieked again, the gun shaking violently against Lily's head. "I want Parker. I want the bitch who ruined my life." Collins, the head of security, had his weapon drawn, but his hands were sweating. He had a clear shot at Silas's shoulder, but the risk of hitting the child was catastrophic. "Sir, please," Collins stammered, his professional facade cracking. "Let the little girl go. She has nothing to do with this." "Shut up!" Silas cried. He dragged Lily a step backward. "Parker, you took everything from me. My company, my wife, my life. Now you're going to watch what happens because of your greed." Vivian finally found her voice, though it was a desperate, reedy whisper she barely recognized as her own. "Money," she blurted out, her hands shaking. "I'll give you money. Whatever you want. $10 million. 20. Just put the gun down." Silas let out a hysterical, broken laugh. "Money? You think this is about money anymore?" "You destroyed my soul, Vivian. I don't want your filthy money. I want you to feel what I feel." The situation was deteriorating by the second. Silas's finger was whitening on the trigger. The security guards were shifting nervously, preparing to take a desperate, highly lethal risk. Vivian was hyperventilating, realizing that this little girl was going to die on her immaculate floor because of her corporate ruthlessness. "Silas." The voice cut through the hysterical tension of the room like a scalpel. It wasn't a shout, it wasn't a plea. It was a calm, steady, and incredibly deep baritone. Everyone's eyes darted to the source. Ariston Whitaker stepped out from behind a marble pillar. He didn't have his hands raised in surrender. He wasn't cowering. He stood perfectly straight, his posture relaxed, his face a mask of absolute, chilling composure. His resting heart rate barely hovered above 60 beats per minute. He had patched up soldiers under heavy artillery fire. He knew that panic was a more contagious killer than bullets. "Silas Croft, right?" Ariston said, taking one slow, deliberate step forward. "Stay back!" Silas barked, pressing the gun harder against Lily. "I'll shoot her. I swear to God I'll do it." Lily let out a sharp cry. "Daddy!" Ariston didn't flinch. He didn't look at his daughter, knowing that showing emotional vulnerability would only give Silas more power. Instead, he kept his dark eyes locked entirely on the gunman. "I know you won't shoot her, Silas," Ariston said, his voice dropping an octave, projecting a soothing, hypnotic authority. He took another slow step forward. "Because you're a transport logistics manager from Oak Park. You used to sponsor a little league baseball team. You're a frustrated man, Silas, a financially ruined man. But you are not a child killer." Vivian stared at Ariston, her jaw literally dropping. "What is he doing?" she thought frantically. "He's going to get his daughter killed." "Stop talking," Silas screamed, his chest heaving. "You don't know me." "I know that the safety on your Springfield 1911 is still engaged," Ariston stated calmly. Silas blinked, momentarily confused. He instinctively glanced down at the weapon in his hand. It was a lie. There was no safety on that specific model, and Ariston knew it. But the split-second distraction was all the opening a combat veteran needed. "And I know," Ariston continued, his voice suddenly hardening into a command that demanded absolute obedience, "that you are going to take the gun away from my daughter's head right now, before you make a mistake you can never, ever take back." Vivian watched in stunned silence. She expected the gunman to snap, to pull the trigger. But instead, she witnessed something incredible. Silas looked at Ariston, really looked at him. He saw a man who wasn't afraid, a man who wasn't judging him, but a man who was offering him a psychological exit from the corner he had backed himself into. Ariston stopped walking. He was now less than 10 feet away. He slowly extended his right hand, palm up. "You wanted Vivian Parker's attention, Silas," Ariston said softly. "You have it. The whole world is going to know what she did to your company. But if you hurt my little girl, nobody will care about your company. They will only remember you as a monster. Don't let her turn you into a monster." The words hit Silas like a physical blow. The absolute truth in Ariston's steady voice penetrated the fog of his rage and despair. He looked at the crying child in his arms. He looked at Vivian, who was trembling violently against the wall. And then he looked at the calm, unwavering father, offering him a way out. Slowly, agonizingly, Silas's arm began to lower. The gun moved away from Lily's temple. I lost everything," Silas sobbed, the fight draining out of him all at once. "I know," Ariston said gently. "Give me the gun, Silas. Let me take my daughter." With a trembling hand, Silas relinquished the weapon. Ariston snatched the gun, instantly ejecting the magazine and clearing the chamber with lightning speed, tossing the dismantled pieces to the floor. In the same fluid motion, he pulled Lily into his chest, burying her face in his neck, finally allowing himself to close his eyes and exhale a shaky breath. Security swarmed Silas, tackling the weeping man to the ground. Vivian Parker stood frozen, her icy blue eyes wide with shock, completely speechless. She had billions of dollars, immense power, and an army of lawyers. But it took a broke, widowed carpenter, making $15 an hour to save a life, armed with nothing but extraordinary courage and radical empathy. As she watched Ariston cradle his daughter amidst the chaos of her ruined lobby, Vivian realized with a sickening twist in her stomach that despite all her wealth, she was the poorest person in the room. And this was only the beginning of how Ariston Whitaker was about to dismantle her entire world. Police cruisers barricaded the shattered glass atrium, their red and blue lights painting the chaotic scene in frantic, pulsing strokes. Paramedics swarmed a catatonic, weeping Silas Croft, while detectives secured the perimeter. Ariston Whitaker refused medical attention. He held Lily tightly against his chest, shielding her face from the flashing cameras of the paparazzi who had already descended upon the headquarters. When a prominent reporter shoved a microphone in his face, demanding to know how he had disarmed a gunman with mere words, Ariston pushed it aside. "Excuse us," he said coldly, stepping into the damp Chicago evening. He had no desire for 15 minutes of fame. He only wanted to take his daughter home. Vivian Parker, however, could not simply walk away. High in her penthouse office, she sat alone, staring out at the city lights. Her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows looked entirely foreign. For a decade, Forbes had dubbed her the Ice Queen of Logistics. She had orchestrated brutal buyouts, crushed unions, and dismantled legacy companies without a second thought. But the image of that terrified little girl with a gun to her head, and the unshakable calm of the father who saved her, now played on a relentless loop in her mind. The heavy oak door swung open, shattering her quiet realization. Richard Hayes, her chief operating officer, marched in. Richard was a corporate shark who viewed every human interaction as a transaction to be won. "We need to get ahead of this, Vivian," Richard snapped, tossing a leather portfolio onto her desk. "The press is already calling Croft a victim of corporate bullying. We issue a statement in 1 hour. We paint Croft as an unstable lunatic who mismanaged his own business, and we emphasize that Parker Logistics was fully within its legal rights." Vivian turned slowly. "He wasn't a lunatic, Richard. He was broken. And we broke him." Richard scoffed, pouring himself a scotch. "Don't tell me you're having a crisis of conscience over a little lobby drama. We absorbed his company. It's just business." "Now, about the carpenter. We need him to sign a non-disclosure agreement immediately. If he goes on television and paints you as the villain, our stock will tank before the opening bell. Offer him $1 million. 2, if he plays hardball. Vivian looked at Richard, truly seeing him for the first time. She saw the same ruthless ambition that had fueled her own rise, stripped of all humanity. "I'll handle Mr. Whittaker," she said softly. The next morning, Vivian's sleek town car pulled into a working-class neighborhood that felt a world away from her corporate towers. She stepped onto the cracked pavement and approached a modest house with a detached garage. The rhythmic hum of a table saw echoed from within. Ariston was covered in a fine layer of sawdust, carefully sanding a cherry wood dining table. He killed the power to the saw as she entered. The sudden silence was heavy. "Miss Parker," Ariston said, his face impassive. "You're lost." Vivian swallowed her pride. She pulled a crisp white envelope from her designer bag. "Mr. Whittaker, I came to thank you. You saved my life. You saved my employees. And I had my team look into your background." Ariston's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You investigated me?" "I know about your late wife, Sarah," Vivian pushed on, her voice trembling slightly. "I know about the crushing medical debt you were left with. Inside this envelope is a cashier's check for $5 million. It's tax-free. It will wipe out your debt and pay for Lily's college." Ariston stared at the envelope. He slowly wiped his hands on a rag, walked over, and took it. For a brief second, Vivian exhaled. Everyone had a price. But Ariston didn't open it. Deliberately, he tore the envelope and the multi-million-dollar check in half, then into quarters. He let the pieces flutter into the sawdust at their feet. "My wife didn't die because we couldn't afford a miracle cure," Ariston said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "She died because a private equity firm bought out our insurance provider and systematically denied her coverage for a life-saving transplant until it was too late. That firm was a subsidiary of the Blackstone Group, the same group that backs Parker Logistics." Vivian felt the blood drain from her face. "Your money is drenched in the suffering of people you consider rounding errors." Ariston stepped closer, his physical presence overwhelming. "You built a glass castle on a foundation of ruined lives, Vivian. Keep your money. You're going to need it when the glass shatters." He turned his back and switched the table saw on. The conversation was over. Vivian fled the shop, her hands shaking violently. Ariston's words had pierced her armor, but the real nightmare was just beginning. By the time she returned to her office, the world had shifted. Security footage of the lobby incident had leaked online. The internet had dubbed Ariston the Zen Father, sharply contrasting his heroic calm with Vivian's paralyzed cowardice. Worse still, an anonymous whistleblower had leaked a massive cache of internal Parker Logistics emails to the press. The documents detailed exactly how Richard Hayes had orchestrated the illegal market manipulation that bankrupted Silas Croft. Parker Logistics' stock was in free fall, and Vivian's board of directors was calling for her head. Midnight rain lashed against the windows of the Parker headquarters. Vivian sat alone, her computer screen illuminating her pale face. She had spent hours digging through the company's deeply encrypted servers, desperate to find the source of the leak. What she found terrified her. The leaked emails placed the blame for Croft's buyout entirely on Vivian, but the unredacted originals, buried in a hidden offshore server, proved her chief operating officer, Richard Hayes, had acted entirely alone. He had forged her digital signature to authorize the illegal corporate sabotage. Furthermore, Richard was secretly negotiating a merger with a massive overseas conglomerate. He had engineered the entire PR crisis to tank the stock price, allowing the rival company to buy Parker Logistics for pennies on the dollar, guaranteeing himself a massive golden parachute. Vivian had been completely outmaneuvered. Suddenly, her screen went black. A red padlock icon appeared. Access denied. Richard had locked her out of the network. The hostile takeover was happening from within. The board of directors was holding an emergency meeting at 9 a.m. to officially vote her out and approve the merger. She had no evidence, no power, and no one to trust, except for one man. At 3 a.m., Ariston Whittaker awoke to a frantic knocking. He grabbed a heavy metal flashlight and opened his front door. Vivian stood on his porch, soaked to the bone and utterly defeated. "You were right," she said, her voice cracking. "The glass shattered, and I have nothing left." Ariston studied her for a long moment. He didn't see a billionaire. He saw a broken woman who had finally realized the true cost of her ambition. "Come in," he said quietly. Sitting at his kitchen table, Vivian laid out the conspiracy. She explained Richard's betrayal, the illegal sabotage of Silas Croft, and the impending destruction of her company. "Why should I care if the vultures tear apart your empire?" Ariston asked, pouring her a mug of black coffee. "Because if Richard wins, thousands of honest employees will lose their pensions," Vivian pleaded. "And that subsidiary that denied your wife's insurance? Richard sits on their advisory board. He built the policies that prioritize profit over human life. I can't stop him alone. But the board is terrified of you." Ariston stared into his mug. The pain of his wife's death was a raw wound. Striking back at the man responsible for the systemic cruelty that killed her was a heavy temptation. "I have physical copies of the unredacted emails locked in a secure off-site data facility," Vivian explained. "My biometric access was revoked. I know the layout, but I can't get in." "You're asking me to break into a corporate data fortress?" "I'm asking you to help me expose a monster," Vivian countered. "If we do this, I swear I will liquidate my majority shares. I will create a foundation for victims of predatory corporate practices. I will tear down the empire I built and use the bricks to fix the damage." Looking at the sincerity burning in her eyes, Ariston slowly stood up. "Get your coat. We have work to do before sunrise." A desperate race against the clock followed. Utilizing Ariston's tactical training and Vivian's intimate knowledge of the architecture, they bypassed the data center's outer perimeter. While Vivian hacked a panel to disable the silent alarms, Ariston quietly neutralized 2 night shift guards, zip-tying them in a break room. They breached the server room with minutes to spare. Vivian frantically downloaded the files onto a flash drive just as the central network flagged the intrusion. Alarms blared. They barely escaped through a loading dock ventilation shaft, sprinting into the rain as police sirens wailed. At 8:55 a.m., Richard Hayes stood at the head of the boardroom table, a smug smile playing on his lips as he outlined the lucrative merger deal to the nervous investors. "It is unfortunate that Vivian's reckless leadership led us to this crisis," Richard said smoothly. "But this merger will save the company from absolute ruin. If we are all in agreement—" The heavy boardroom doors slammed open. Vivian marched in, her eyes blazing with dangerous fire. Beside her walked Ariston, his presence commanding absolute, terrified silence from the executives. "The only thing ruined in this room is your career, Richard," Vivian declared, tossing a thick stack of printed emails onto the mahogany table. "Unredacted communications proving you orchestrated the illegal market manipulation, forged my authorization, and conspired to tank our stock." Richard's smug smile vanished into pale panic. "Security! Remove these trespassers immediately." "Security isn't coming," Ariston said, his deep voice echoing. "But the authorities are. I forwarded those files to the SEC, the FBI, and the Wall Street Journal." Police sirens drifted up from the streets below, growing rapidly louder. Richard lunged for the door, but Ariston easily blocked his path. "Don't move," he said calmly. The board members scrambled away in horror as federal agents swarmed into the room, slapping handcuffs onto a furious Richard Hayes. In the weeks that followed, the corporate landscape underwent a seismic shift. Richard faced decades in federal prison. Silas Croft was exonerated and successfully sued for the return of his company assets. True to her word, Vivian shocked the financial world by stepping down as CEO. She liquidated half her net worth to establish the Parker-Whitaker Initiative, a heavily funded watchdog foundation dedicated to fighting predatory corporate takeovers and medical insurance monopolies. She did not do it alone. Sitting in the brightly lit offices of the foundation, Vivian looked across the table at her new co-director. Ariston was still wearing jeans and a t-shirt, looking entirely out of place among the glass and steel, yet perfectly at home. "The Blackstone executives are furious about our latest injunction," Vivian smiled. "Let them be angry," Ariston replied, looking out at the Chicago skyline. "They're just learning that there are some things in this world they can't buy." Vivian nodded, feeling a profound sense of peace. She had lost her empire, but she had finally found her soul. Are you tired of watching corporate greed destroy innocent lives? If Ariston's incredible courage and Vivian's powerful redemption story inspired you, don't let this message fade. Smash that like button, share this video to expose the hidden truths of the billionaire world, and subscribe to our channel for more jaw-dropping, real-life stories of justice and karma. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload.